as Chrissy was saying, my name's Larry Decuers, and I'm one of the curators at the National WWII Museum. And I thought I would share with you today some of our A2 flight jackets we have in the collection. Now, the ones I'm going to show you today, most of those have artwork on them. And the ones with the artwork tend to be more desirable with collectors, and they tend to be a little more rare as well. So once World War II started, they continued to produce about, I'd say about 1 million of these A2 jackets. And out of that 1 million, I would say about 10% of them have artwork of any kind on them. So they're kind of rare. Also, something that's noteworthy here is these A2 flight jackets actually make up the majority of our combat worn uniform collection. Combat worn uniforms are kind of a rarity, especially with ground forces from World War II. You know, the combat arms soldiers, people who are on the front lines living in the dirt, their uniforms were so ragged by the time they came out of the field that in many cases they just threw them away and were issued completely new ones. Not so with these leather flight jackets. I guess the fact that they're leather, they held up a little better. But also they kind of became a status symbol, and they were just as prestigious as the silver wings that these airmen wore on their chest. So to give you a little background about the A2 flight jackets, they're U.S. Army Air Force's issue. So no one in the Navy or the Marine Corps had these jackets. These are specific to the U.S. Army Air Forces. And when the United States entered World War II in December of 1941, U.S. Army Air Forces were about 350,000 strong. So there's this rapid expansion that takes place in the next 18 months. And in June of 43, there are now 2 million service members in the U.S. Army Air Forces. So the path of a pilot or flight crew at that time was aviation cadets would spend 36 weeks training just to become a pilot. And this wasn't 36 weeks from induction to combat, but 36 weeks just to fly. So that 36 weeks of flight training was divided into 3 sections: 12 weeks in primary flight school, where they learned the basics of flight. And then another 12 weeks in basic, where they flew more advanced aircraft. And then the last 12 weeks was advanced flight training, which they flew AT-6s, aircraft that were a little more modern. Then they spent another 10 weeks in transition flying training, where they were actually trained to fly the type of aircraft they were going to be operating in combat. And then another 12 weeks was spent in unit and crew training. So they knew how to fly formation and basic combat tactics, things of that nature. So let me share my screen with you so we can start taking a look at these jackets. All right. So bombardiers and navigators and other officers that were air crew, their path was about 20 weeks in training. So navigators spent 20 weeks in training, bombardiers spent 20 weeks in training. And then they all went to a gunnery school that lasted 6 weeks. Now, those those A2 flight jackets, usually cadets were issued those between primary and basic flight school. And usually it was just the quartermaster pulling them out of a box and issuing them to these guys. But it was a pretty big moment for these guys to get this leather jacket. Now, here you get a pretty good look at the A2 jacket. So some of the features of the A2 are the horsehide construction. So at the beginning of the war, the specification was horsehide. But that eventually was expanded to goat skin and cowhide. But cowhide and horsehide is very difficult to differentiate. So you can't hardly tell if it's horse or cow. But goat looks different. It's pebbled, and goat skin tends to be a little stronger. Now, some of the history of this this A2 flight jacket here, if I haven't mentioned it already, and I apologize if I have, it's adopted for service in 1931. And it has the distinction of being one of the first military garments to have a zipper. It may even be the first military garment to have a zipper, I'm not quite sure. But the zipper was actually invented in 1928. And this jacket's predecessor was the A1. Now the A1 looks very similar to the A2. It has the wool knits at the cuffs and the wool knit waistband that you see there. The only difference is it doesn't have the shirt collar like you see on this. It has more of a varsity letterman's collar. And the closure is done with buttons instead of a zipper. Also, another distinguishing feature on these jackets is the two patch pockets on the front. Now on wartime A2 jackets, you won't find hand warmer pockets. There were no places to stick your hands in your pockets on this jacket. And another feature I'll show you when we get to the back of one of these jackets, it's a single back panel construction. The idea was if there was a seam running down the middle, it might get snagged on, these primitive cockpits. So having just one piece of leather to make up the back of the jacket gave the jacket more strength. Another reason these jackets were made of leather is because when they were first introduced in the early 30s, a lot of the aircraft of that day were still open cockpit. And leather was pretty much the only game in town if you wanted something wind resistant and something that had some water resistant properties, as well as some protection against fire. And that leather in these jackets would offer some of that. Now, the owner of this jacket is Joseph W. Geary. Now, Geary served as a navigator aboard B-24s in the 15th Air Force. Now, the 15th Air Force was a strategic bombing organization based in Italy. Now, Geary completed 50 plus combat missions while in Italy. Now, the patch, you get a pretty good close-up of this patch here. This is a patch from the 721st Bombardment Squadron. Now, this was designed by Disney. Another interesting thing about Disney Studios during World War II is they had 5 full-time artists in an office, and all they did was create distinctive military unit insignia for the war effort. Now, Walt Disney did have some restrictions about what characters could appear in certain types of insignias. For example, Walt Disney didn't want Mickey Mouse associated with combat units. So you won't find Mickey Mouse in squadron insignias of combat units. However, this is kind of ironic. Mickey Mouse did adorn the cowling of one of Germany's leading fighter aces, Adolf Galan. He had an image of Mickey Mouse painted on the side of his Bf-109 aircraft. So I guess Disney couldn't sue him over that, you know. But anyway, this character here is a parrot that was introduced in a Donald Duck short in 1942. And this parrot, you might recognize him from the feature film that came out a few years later called the Three Caballeros. Now, on Geary's left shoulder is a patch from the 15th Air Force, or the 15th Air Force's insignia. Now, this is a theater-made patch. Now, the Air Force, or the U.S. Army Air Forces, was a global organization in World War II. They were everywhere. So a lot of these jackets, you can almost place by the way these patches were made. So when these bases sprung up, the local inhabitants, they produced insignia, and they probably made a pretty good living producing these patches. So some of the key features you see from patches produced in Italy are the incised leather. So the craftsman would take like a channel knife and carve these grooves into the leather. So you see the wings there, that's all carved out. And then they would hand paint it. So here you see Geary's artwork on the back. Now, from what I've noticed, this artwork kind of runs the gamut from being extremely crude to being very highly detailed and professionally done. So this is one of the more detailed ones I've seen in our collection. So we have Geary's aircraft there, a B-24J. I don't know if you can see the nose of it, but it is a J model. And the aircraft's releasing its payload over a target. And then surrounding the image, we see some targets that Geary flew against. So it's Vienna, Ploesti, Budapest. But this is a really well done piece of artwork on this jacket. And here you can easily see that single back panel construction I mentioned earlier. Now, this jacket is from the service of First Lieutenant William F. Wolge. Now, Wolge served as a bombardier aboard B-26s, A-20s, and A-26s with the 12th Air Force. Now, the 12th Air Force was a tactical bombing organization, so their job was to support ground forces. They would attack bridges, troop concentrations, just kind of pave the way for the ground forces. So they're also in the Mediterranean theater of operations. So this patch right here, this Thunderbird patch, the 34th Bombardment Squadron, this is a very famous squadron patch. Famous because of the Doolittle raid, actually. When World War II started, this squadron was equipped with B-25s, and a lot of the air crews that flew on the Doolittle raid came from this squadron. In the summer of '42, though, the 34th transitioned to B-26s and were assigned to the 12th Air Force shortly thereafter. And above the patch, you can see Wolge's wings there. Now, that's theater made as well, and they're just kind of stamped out. Another interesting thing about air crew wings is they're crew position specific, I guess you could say. So those are bombardier wings. You can see there's a bomb that's headed towards a target that's superimposed over a pair of wings. So just by looking at a serviceman's wings, you can tell what his job was. And again, we have the incised leather that you see that's so common in the Mediterranean theater. So they initially serve in North Africa, but then they move along with as the war moves into Italy, Sardinia, Corsica. So on the other side, we see the 97th Bombardment Squadron patch. Now, Wolge was transferred from the B-26 unit to the A-20 unit. Now, he flew 53 combat missions with that unit. Now, this is kind of unusual to see a former and a current unit both on the same jacket at the same, or on the jacket at the same time. It's something that the Navy kind of did. Like you could, keep putting patches of units you served with on your flight jacket, but that wasn't the case with the Army Air Force. You were just supposed to have your current unit on there. But I could see why he would want to hang on to that patch, because it was so closely associated with the Doolittle Raiders. But in November of 1944, Wolge started flying in A-26s, which was a pretty advanced aircraft, but flew the same ground attack role as the A-20. And on his left sleeve is the 12th Air Force insignia, and that's been hand painted on there. On the right side, he has a hand painted American flag. And this jacket is from the service of Staff Sergeant Harry T. Corbin. Now, initially, these A-2 flight jackets were only issued to officers, but that was expanded as the war went on. So now enlisted personnel could be issued the jacket or could have an example of it. Now, Corbin was a ball turret gunner aboard B-17s. Now, ball turret gunners, that was probably the last place you'd want to be on one of these aircrafts. It was a self-contained turret, and you would assume the fetal position inside of it. And you sat between the receivers of 250 caliber machine guns. It was a powered turret, but not a good place to be. It was literally slung underneath the aircraft, and these crew members were completely isolated and cut off from the rest of the crew. But Corbin survived. He flew 51 combat missions and accumulated a total of 262 hours of combat flying time. And again, we have a theater-made patch here. Now see, you can see the difference here between the different types of wings. So Corbin's wings are aerial gunner's wings. So you see a winged bullet there superimposed over a pair of wings. And then this was a very common practice among air crews, and these tallies were painted on the side of their aircraft as well. So the bombs represent completed combat missions. So, the mission quotas were different. They were at commander's discretion. So in the 8th Air Force, which was the strategic bombing organization based in England during World War II, initially they had a quota of 25 missions, and or for heavy crews, I should say. So B-24s, B-17s. The mission quota was initially 25 missions, and then as the Allies gained air superiority, that mission quota was extended to 30, then 35. But in the Mediterranean theater, especially in the 15th Air Force, heavy bomber crews were flying 50+ missions. So a little unfair to the 15th Air Force guys, I would say. And you can see the back of Corbin's jacket here. We have a B-17. Now this looks like a E or F model. And I don't think you can see the wing. I don't know if the screens are blocking it, but something interesting I found on this jacket is there's 2 different types of national insignia on this aircraft. You see on the fuselage, they have one of the earlier rondelles. just the star without the bar through it. But on the wing, there's the star with the bar through it. So those insignia are about, I think in early 43, they come out with that star and bar insignia. But I just thought that was a little interesting. But I find that this aircraft is, or this scene is well done as well. Now this jacket is from the service of First Lieutenant Dennis Rawls Jr. Now, Rawls has a very interesting service record. He flies his first tour in the 8th Air Force as a co-pilot aboard V-17s. Then he volunteers for a second tour of duty as a fighter pilot. So he flies P-51 Mustangs with the 503rd Fighter Squadron of the 339th Fighter Group. And his artwork is really impressive. On the back panel, there's his nickname, Tampa Kid, and then a very well done B-17G there, superimposed over the 8th Air Force insignia. And then he has his mission tally arranged around that. Another interesting thing is Rawls looks like he doesn't update his jacket to represent his service and fighters. So this is strictly from his B-17 days. Another interesting story associated with this jacket. This was donated to us in 2017, I believe, by Rawls' son, who was a commercial pilot. And he shared this story with me. His son, Rawls' grandson, is a current Air Force pilot. And a few years back, when he was graduating flight school, Rawls, wearing that jacket, pinned his grandson's wings on. So I thought that was a pretty neat story. All right, this flight jacket is from another enlisted man, Staff Sergeant Kirby Wost. So Wost flew as a flight engineer aboard B-24s. And again, this is another 15th Air Force piece, so there's a very high mission tally, 50 combat missions. Flight engineers, almost everyone on a heavy bomber had a dual role. So the flight engineer was basically the in-flight mechanic. And once they got into, crossed into enemy territory, he would man the top turret of the aircraft. So you see the artwork on the back of his jacket there. So there's his aircraft, B-24J Liberator. And again, it's dropping its payload. But you can see Wost positioned directly behind the cockpit, the top turret there. In Wost's memoirs, he has another interesting story. He started his tour in February of '44, which was pretty much the height of the air war in Europe. Heavy losses for the Army Air Forces. So about 3 days after he begins his tour, he gets a telegram notifying him that he's a father. So every mission he flew after that, he would recite the 23rd Psalms and pray that he would live to see his son. And he actually survived the war, and he made it home. And he recalls the day he decided that, well, he would make it. On one of his last missions, a big chunk of German flak hit his turret, went through his turret, and bounced off his helmet. He knew he'd make it home after that. Then on the right sleeve, we see an American flag, which is very common in MTO. And then there again, there's the mission tally. And a hand-painted 15th Air Force shoulder insignia. Now, this jacket here is from the China-Burma-India theater. This is from the service of Thomas M. Saunders. Now, he's a liaison pilot with the 14th Air Force. Now, liaison pilots generally flew the L-5 Grasshopper, and mostly those pilots spotted for the artillery. But in some cases, these aircraft were modified to carry casualties. So this patch, I'm not sure, I can't figure out what unit it's from, but I have a pretty good idea. It's an air evacuation squadron. I don't know if you can see the patch very well, but the patch is a Jeep with a tail structure on the back and a grasshopper drive in it. And then there's like a medic's bag in there. So I would assume this is a air evacuation squadron. Now these aircraft were modified to carry casualties from the battlefield to medical facilities. So we take a good look at this patch here. And as I mentioned, with local craftsmen in Italy, craftsmen in the China-Burma-India theater had their own signature method of assembling and creating these insignia. So they would cut out the shapes they needed to make the patch, then sew all these things together. It was like a leather composition patch. So it gave these patches a three-dimensional look, and then these are really neat. And I think it's more visible in this photo here. This is the China-Burma-India command patch. So you can see how the stripes and the stars are individual pieces that have been individually sewn and painted to give it that appearance. Now on the back of this jacket is something that's you see in a lot of China-Burma-India jackets. This is known as the bloodshed. So what you have going on here is the nationalist Chinese flag along with the American flag. And the writing roughly says, I'm an American here fighting the Japanese. I'm in trouble. If you get me back to American lines, you'll be rewarded. So this isn't actually an official version of the bloodshed. So official examples are made of silk or rayon, and those had a serial number, and those had cash value. Now, I would assume the United States government back then would have made good on this locally made theater one if a local had could prove that he helped a down pilot. But generally speaking, those were the official ones were backed by the government. And this is one that's just been made by a local vendor. Now, in 1943, those cool leather A2 jackets were discontinued. They became what's known as limited standard. Now that meant if you were issued one in flight school and you had lost it or had been destroyed, you could request another one. Now for airmen entering, training in 1943, they were issued this jacket. This is a B-10 flight jacket. Now, the B-10 looks very similar to the A2, but it's cloth shelled, but a lot of the features kind of remain the same. So there's the knit wool cuffs and the wool knits at the waist of the jacket. Now these were, I think, much more functional, and that's one of the reasons why General Arnold discontinued the A2 is because its day had kind of passed. These aircraft are now operating at very high altitudes, 25, 30,000 feet. It's very cold up there. And those leather A2 jackets are nothing more than windbreakers. They're not very warm at all. And another thing about leather, when it gets cold, it becomes very restrictive, and it kind of limits your movements. So you didn't have that problem with these cloth shell jackets. And also they line these with alpaca, which is extremely warm. And then there's the fur collar as well. Now the back of the jacket looks very similar to the A2 as well. So it's a solid panel on the back. Then in 1944, another jacket comes along. This is the B-15 flight jacket. Now, it's almost exactly the same as the B-10, except now they have slash pockets in the jacket, so you have somewhere to warm your hands up. But the B-15 flight jacket, that basic design, I mean, lives on for generations. I mean, it's modified, and the shell's made out of nylon, but it stays in service for a very, very long time. It's much more utilitarian jacket. Now, some of the things you'll see on these B-15s and B-10s is a silk screened U.S. Army Air Force's General Headquarters patch printed on them. But we have a few of these in the collection that have artwork on them, but not nearly as many as examples of these as A2s. I think the A2s were just, you know, a little cooler, more of a status symbol. And even though these were better jackets, I think a lot of guys resented not getting the leather version of these. Those leather jackets were so popular that even soldiers and servicemen in different branches other than the Army Air Forces were clamoring to get their hands on one. You see a lot of these A2 jackets acquired by members of airborne units as well, but they would have been hard to get, and that kind of brought on a whole nother, I guess, cottage industry of privately made A2 jackets. So if you could get a military spec jacket, you could privately purchase it and wear it. Another famous, I guess, World War II icon you see wearing a A2 leather jacket is, of course, General MacArthur. It was a very popular uniform piece, and they've survived today. And the Air Force came out with a variation of the A2. It's not the same as the World War II version. It's very different. But in the late 80s, they adopted that again to boost recruiting numbers. But let's see. All right. So that's all the jackets I had. I was thinking we could probably do some questions now. All right. So William K. asks, my wife has her dad's A2 with art on the back. What's the best method to store the jacket? Well, you want to, a World War II A2 jacket, you definitely want to keep out of the light and keep in a dark place. And you want to keep it at least 70 degrees with less than 50% humidity. And that'll preserve it for as long as possible. All this stuff, it's unfortunate, but eventually all this stuff is eventually going to, disintegrate. So all we can do is kind of slow that the decomposition of these things. Also, Richard asks, is the jacket insulated? What is its lining? Initially, when these things were made in 1931, they had a silk lining inside of them, brown silk lining. Once the war started, silk was a little more expensive, and also it's a vital material for the construction of parachutes. So they went to a tobacco-colored cotton lining. Another practice that fighter aces would do after you scored your 5th kill, a lot of times these guys would take out that cotton lining and have a red silk lining put in the jacket. I've never seen one in person, but apparently that was a practice. Okay, so Michelle wants to know, what kind of pants did they wear? Well, when they were flying missions, especially heavy bombardment groups who were operating at 25 to 30,000 feet, they would wear a electrically lined undersuit that would plug in to a power supply on the aircraft. And then early in the war, they would wear, over that, they would wear sheep shearling, which is, pretty much a sheep turned inside out, for lack of a better explanation. But eventually those garments became cloth shelled as well. Right. Okay. Brett asks, always wondered why no pockets in most jackets, for not snagging on equipment. Well, actually, putting your hands in your pockets is a no-no in the military anyway. So you're just not supposed to do it. It's nobody, it's against regs. So I think that was one of the major driving forces behind no hand warmer pockets. Ryan wants to know, with the A2, were they painted during their tours or after their tours were finished? For instance, with bombs painted for each mission, would those have been painted after each mission or after their 35 mission tour was over, for example? I think these jackets were decorated as they went along. I think that the people providing the artwork were usually the most talented or gifted people in their squadron or group, and I think they tried to keep up with that. Okay, and then we have a question from Tommy Lofton. Hi, Tommy Lofton. He asks, were the manufacturers of the B-10s and the B-15s the same as the A2? No, they weren't. So there were about, I would say, a dozen or more manufacturers for the A2 leather jacket. So a lot of these were sports equipment companies before the war, sporting good equipment companies, I should say, and menswears companies. But I think they may have had a few bleed over, contractors who were producing both B-10s and A2s. But generally speaking, it was two different sets of contractors. Okay. Where would the rank emblem go on the jackets? Okay, so on the A2s, you see the epaulets on the top of the jacket here. So your rank would go at the end here. I don't know if you can see that. All right, and we have Jake wants to know, what kind of jackets did naval aviators wear? Well, naval aviators wore what I would call a leather version of the B-10. Now, those jackets were called 422As and eventually G1s. Now, those were made of goat skin. They had the knits, just like the A2 and the B-10, and they had the furry collar up top. So they looked like a leather version, a goat skin version of the B-10, I guess is the best way to describe them. Now, the Navy and the Marine Corps, they weren't nearly as liberal with their airmen painting on their aircraft or their jackets. So that's why you kind of see more of this with the Army Air Forces. I think the Army Air Forces was given these guys a wide berth because the attrition rate was so great, and these guys were civilians, basically, who were temporarily soldiers, I guess you could say. All right, Jane from Facebook. We have one leather bomber jacket that smells so bad. What do you recommend to get rid of the smell? I mean, the only thing I could suggest, I wouldn't apply any type of leather preservative. I don't have a background in conservation, so I'm really not the best person to answer that question. The only thing I would do is let it air dry, I guess, in a safe place, dark place, if that's possible. All right. Raymond wants to know, how many jackets do you have in the collection? The A2 jackets, we probably have close to 60, I would say. And then M422As, the Navy and Marine Corps ones, we have a lot less of. I would say under a dozen. B10s, B15s, we have a lot of. Then there's also, you get into a heavier class of flight jackets like the B3s, the shearling lined ones, B6s, D1s. We have several examples of those as well. All in all, I'd say, maybe close to 70 jackets would be a good guess. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope to see you next time. And again, if you have any more additional questions, just email them. They'll get them to me, and we'll try and answer them. Thanks a lot.